Hello! Today I want to talk to you about the concept of the revisionism of the Second World War and its different perspectives. I also want to introduce it to a series of interviews I intend to do with different people that are revisionists of the Second World War, but that all have different political opinions about it. My goal of doing this is always to debunk the myth that the Second World War was a good war, since it is often used to sell other unjustified wars. I therefore sympathize with the people that are revisionists, even if I don't fully agree with them. So, what means the concept of revisionism of the Second World War? There are certainly different interpretations for specific meanings, but generally it's the idea that the Second World War was not a good, necessary, and justified war against Germany and Japan, contrarily to what is portrayed by most politicians, especially those who won that war, but also mainstream historians, the medias, and Hollywood movie, or what I call the conformist perspective. That being said, it does not mean that someone who is a revisionist automatically thinks that Germany and Japan were good and justified. It's true that some revisionists do think that way, but it's not all of them. And sadly, when a mainstream or conformist view of the Second World War calls someone a revisionist, it's almost always in a pejorative sense, and they usually accuse the person of being supportive of Nazi Germany and Japan, even if they don't. So, that is why I want to describe these different perspectives that I observed throughout my readings and learning of this subject. So, here are the four main perspectives I think exist. There may be more, so feel free to tell me what you think. So, there is the non-interventionist perspective, the one to which I agree. There is also the pacifist perspective, the Marxist perspective, and the perspective that support Nazi Germany, which is obviously the most controversial. So, let's start. The non-interventionist perspective is about opposing the intervention of the state and rests mainly on two arguments, a pragmatic and a moral one. This perspective mostly includes libertarians like me, but not exclusively. There are people that are against the intervention of the state on the specific issue of war, but that support it on other issues. People like the America First Committee of 1940 with Charles Lindbergh, the politician Robert Taft of the time, the author Pat Buchanan, and many more, which are called paleoconservatives. The pragmatic argument of the non-interventionist perspective is based on the conclusion that the Second World War was not a justified war and that it would have been better to not intervene against Germany and to not provoke Japan, that were not a threat to Western Europe and North America, and that there were terrible unintended consequences like the spreading of communism, the Holocaust, and the Cold War. Those who are libertarians oppose such a war specifically on the moral standpoint because it violates the non-aggression principle, the NAP, and property right. It's quite simple. Libertarians believe that if the state must exist, it should be limited in its role to protect individuals and legitimate private property against aggression, nothing more. In order to wage such a war, the state needs to impose conscription, taxation, inflation, central planning, censorship, forced indoctrination, and it will cause a lot of collateral damages and unintended consequences, which are all huge violations of the libertarian moral principles. Libertarians also believe that the intervention of the state in the economy is the cause of imperialism. I must admit that it's not all people that call themselves libertarians that agree with me on this. Some of them believe the war against Germany and Japan was justified. But my experience of debating with them is that, like most conformist people, they often deny or ignore important historical facts that are presented to them, and they fall victim to the propaganda that succeeded in scaring them about the so-called risk that the world was to be conquered by the Nazi and Japan. So, examples of revisionist authors that are non-interventionist are Ralph Raico with his book Great Wars and Great Leaders, a libertarian rebuttal, William Henry Chamberlain with America's Second Crusade, Richard Ebling and Jacob Hornberger with The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, Pat Buchanan with his great book Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, Murray Rothbard with Revisionism for Our Time, and David Gordon, who wrote an article called World War II A Reading List that you can find on the website of the Mises Institute with a list of more books about the Second World War. Now, the pacifist perspective is quite simple. They fundamentally reject the use of violence, especially organized violence. This is different from the non-interventionist perspective that is not rooted in pacifism. For example, libertarians believe in the right to use violence against aggression. That is why they call it the non-aggression principle, which means it's wrong to initiate the use of violence, but it's legitimate to react and defend against someone who commits the aggression. Though a libertarian could decide to not do it and call himself a pacifist if he wants, but he can only do it as an individual choice. Usually, pacifists recognize and oppose the evils of imperialism, militarism, conscription, collateral damage, and the killing of innocent civilians. But if I can allow me a criticism of pacifists is that they are far from being in favor of the free market. They rarely oppose taxation and regulation as a form of violence from the state. Still, I can admire and respect them. Examples of revisionist pacifists authors are Nicholson Baker with Human Smoke, which is a great book, Ted Grimsrud with The Good War That Wasn't, David Swanson with Leaving World War II Behind, and Edward Wood Jr. with Worshipping the Myths of World War II. Also, Mahatma Gandhi, spoke against World War II from a pacifist perspective. Now, the Marxist perspective. The Marxist perspective considers that the Second World War was not a good war because it was an imperialist war. But for them, the fundamental cause is the capitalist system, which is the private property of the means of production and the nation-state system. This is very fascinating because while clearly Marxists and libertarians are in absolute opposition for what is the ideal economic system, sometimes they appear as a kind of mirror reflection of each other. They both recognize that imperialism has root in the state being used for the financial interests of national corporations against other nations. But Marxists want to abolish private property, and they believe that their utopia will eventually lead to the natural elimination of the state, while libertarian wants either to abolish the state or to reduce it to almost nothing, and they want to preserve private property as an absolute. So, for the Marxists, the Soviets were kind of the good guy of World War II, even if they are divided between Trotskyists and Stalinists. Trotsky himself clearly defended the Soviet Union even if he hated its leaders. Marxists consider that both the Western Allies and the Axis were imperialists fighting for control of markets and resources, which I agree, by the way. Marxists will also show that there were factions among the Western Allies. Marxists will show that there were factions among the Western Allies that had different ambitions. Some wanted to support or let Nazi Germany fight against the Soviet Union, while some others wanted to fight directly against Nazi Germany. Marxists consider that being a liberal democracy or a fascist dictatorship doesn't change the fundamental nature that imperialism is rooted in capitalism, and that a form of fascism is almost guaranteed to emerge when the bourgeoisie fears for its dominance. In fact, for the Marxists, Hitler was not an abstract evil out of nowhere. He was a reaction against the threat of communism in Germany. So he was a defender of capitalism for them. Examples of Marxist authors are Jacques Pauwels, who wrote many books like The Myth of the Good War and Big Business with Hitler. Leon Trotsky himself wrote the manifesto of the Fourth International on Imperialist War in 1940. Vladimir Lenin had written Imperialism, the Supreme State of Capitalism in 1916. And I also think that Gabriel Kolko and Howard Zinn, who were against capitalism, that were also critical of World War II as a good war. Finally, the pro-Germany perspective. This perspective rests on the idea that Nazi Germany was legitimate in most of its actions related to the Second World War, and that they reacted to provocation in self-defense and self-determination. People of that perspective are usually very friendly to the Nazi regime that they consider either good or at least not as bad as the conformist view tends to say. Of course, they also believe that the war crime and the mass killings done by Nazi Germany are either false or exaggerated, or the inevitable and sad result of the Allies having destroyed Germany. They say that the Allies distorted the reality in order to justify their own war against Germany. Of course, I don't fully agree with that perspective, but I don't fully disagree either. Obviously, my main disagreement is the idea that Nazi Germany was a good political regime and that they had no imperialist ambition, which they clearly had for my view. For me, Nazism embodies mainly German imperialism with a flavor of nationalism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism, but also the rejection of the unfair Versailles Treaty and the self-determination of German people. But I do agree that the war was not only Germany's fault. The Western Allies clearly provoked and threatened Germany and Japan. The Western Allies were hugely hypocrites in their claim that they were waging a good war. All the big nations that participated in the Second World War were all evil and imperialist. There are many revisionist authors who sympathize with Nazi Germany, but I prefer not to name them without their permission in order to avoid being accused of defamation, since it is a very unpopular position. I do have sympathy for the fact that many of them have been victims of repression, censorship, and even imprisonment for simply expressing their views. So, thanks for listening. I hope I have helped you see more clearly about the concept of revisionism of the Second World War. If we can resume and simplify, the conformist views blame Germany and Japan for the war, but for the revisionists, the problem is either the state, the violence, the capitalist system, or those who were not kind with Germany and Japan. If you have disagreement, comments, or want to be part of this conversation, don't hesitate to contact me. I hope to present you some interview with revisionist authors very soon. Thank you very much.